On December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines and the explosion of bombs. This was the attack on Pearl Harbor, a surprise military strike by the Empire of Japan on the United States Pacific Fleet at its naval base at Pearl Harbor on Oahu. At that time, the United States was a neutral country in World War II. This air raid, launched from Japanese aircraft carriers, resulted in the U.S. declaring war on Japan the very next day. Within the Japanese military leadership, the operation was known as the Hawaii Operation, had been referred to as Operation Z during its planning phases. The path to this devastating attack was paved by months of tense and ultimately failed negotiations between the United States and Japan over the future of the Pacific. Japan's key demands included that the U.S. end its economic sanctions against Japan, cease its aid to China in the ongoing Second Sino-Japanese War, and allow Japan access to the vital natural resources of the Dutch East Indies. In a critical move, Japan dispatched its powerful naval attack group from Haito-Kapu Bay in the Kuriles Islands on November 26, 1941. This departure occurred just prior to the Japanese government receiving the hull note from the United States, a document which formally stated the American demand that Japan withdraw completely from China and French Indochina. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the primary architect of the attack, had planned it as a preemptive strike. His strategic objective was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which had been based at Pearl Harbor since 1940, thereby preventing it from interfering with Japan's planned military campaigns across Southeast Asia. Yamamoto held a calculated hope that this decisive blow would grant Japan the time to secure rapid territorial gains, after which they could negotiate a favorable peace from a position of strength. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just one part of a massive, coordinated offensive. Over a span of 7 hours, Japan also launched assaults on the U.S.-held Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, as well as the British Empire's holdings in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The Japanese strike force, under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commenced its attack at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. The base was assaulted by a total of 353 aircraft, including fighters, level bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, which were launched in 2 distinct waves from 6 aircraft carriers. The damage to the American fleet was catastrophic. Of the 8 U.S. Navy battleships present in the harbor that day, all were damaged, and 4 were sunk. However, in a remarkable feat of naval salvage, all but the USS Arizona were later raised, and 6 of the 8 were eventually returned to service to fight in the war. The destruction was not limited to the battleships. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. On the ground, the devastation was equally severe. More than 180 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, most of them caught on the ground before they could get airborne. The human cost was staggering. A total of 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 others were wounded in the attack. Japanese losses, by comparison, were far lighter, totaling 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 129 men. Crucially for the future of the naval war in the Pacific, the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers stationed at Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea at the time of the attack and escaped unharmed. Furthermore, important base installations, including the massive oil storage tanks and the naval repair facilities, were not targeted, a strategic oversight that would later prove critical. The diplomatic context of the attack was as significant as the military action itself. Japan declared war on the United States and the British Empire later on December 7, which was already December 8 in Tokyo, but these formal declarations were not delivered until the following day. On December 8, both the United Kingdom and the United States formally declared war on Japan. Then, on December 11, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan under the Tripartite Pact, though they had no formal obligation to do so after Japan initiated the conflict, each declared war on the United States. The United States responded in kind with its own declaration of war against Germany and Italy. While there were historical precedents for Japan undertaking unannounced military action, the complete lack of any formal warning before the attack, and the widespread perception that it was an unprovoked act of aggression, led President Franklin D. Roosevelt to famously label December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, in his address to Congress. The attack remains the deadliest event ever to occur on Hawaiian soil, and it stood as the deadliest foreign attack on American soil until the September 11 attacks in 2001. The background to this conflict stretched back decades. War between the Empire of Japan and the United States had been considered a possibility since the 1920s. Japan had grown increasingly wary of American territorial and military expansion in the Pacific and Asia since the late 1890s, particularly the American annexation of islands like Hawaii and the Philippines, which lay close to or within what Japan considered its sphere of influence. Concurrently, Japanese strategic thinkers were convinced that their nation needed to achieve economic self-sufficiency to wage a modern war effectively. The lessons of World War I had taught them that modern conflicts would be protracted, require total national mobilization, and create severe vulnerabilities to trade embargoes and strategic encirclement. Consequently, Japan felt it needed guaranteed access to strategically vital resources, such as iron and oil, which could not be sufficiently extracted from the Japanese home islands. Although Japan had begun to adopt a more hostile stance toward the United States after the rejection of its racial equality proposal at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the relationship between the two nations remained cordial enough to continue as trading partners throughout the 1920s. Serious tensions did not begin to escalate dramatically until Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Over the following decade, Japan expanded its war in China, leading to the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Japan devoted considerable effort to isolating China and endeavored to secure enough independent resources to attain victory on the mainland. The Southern Operation, the plan to invade Southeast Asia, was designed to assist these efforts. Nevertheless, Japan remained heavily reliant on oil imports from the United States, a dependency that included fueling its forces in occupied Manchuria. This reliance created a critical point of leverage for the United States. Starting in December 1937, a series of events, including the Japanese attack on the U.S. gunboat USS Panay, the Allison Incident, and the horrific Nanking Massacre, swung Western public opinion sharply against Japan. In response, the United States unsuccessfully proposed a joint action with the United Kingdom to blockade Japan. Then, in 1938, following a personal appeal from President Roosevelt, American companies voluntarily stopped providing Japan with implements of war, though oil exports continued. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, attempting to stymie the flow of supplies reaching China through the region. The United States responded by halting shipments of airplanes, parts, machine tools, and aviation gasoline to Japan, which the Japanese government perceived as a profoundly unfriendly act. Notably, the U.S. did not initially cease oil exports, partly because of a prevailing sentiment in Washington that given Japan's extreme dependence on American oil, such an action would be considered an extreme provocation and might trigger the very war they sought to avoid. In a significant show of force, President Roosevelt moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet from its home port in San Diego to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in mid-1940. He also ordered a military buildup in the Philippines, taking both actions in the hope of discouraging further Japanese aggression in the Far East. However, the Japanese High Command interpreted these moves differently. They were mistakenly certain that any Japanese attack on the United Kingdom's Southeast Asian colonies, including Singapore, would inevitably bring the United States into the war. From their perspective, a devastating preventive strike against the U.S. fleet appeared to be the only way to eliminate American naval interference before it could begin. An invasion of the Philippines was also considered necessary by Japanese war planners to secure their southern flank. Ironically, the American War Plan Orange had originally envisioned a robust defense of the Philippines, but this option was never implemented due to opposition from General Douglas MacArthur, who felt the force required would be 10 times larger than planned. By 1941, American planners themselves expected to abandon the Philippines at the outbreak of a Pacific War. The final, decisive break came in July 1941. Following Japan's seizure of southern French Indochina in the wake of the fall of France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands froze Japanese assets and imposed a complete oil embargo. This decision forced Japan's hand. With its oil reserves dwindling, it proceeded with definitive plans to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. On August 17, a stern President Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take opposing steps if neighboring countries were attacked. Throughout 1941, Japan and the United States engaged in a series of intense diplomatic negotiations, attempting to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. At one point, Japan offered to withdraw from most of China and Indochina after making peace with the Chinese nationalist government. It also proposed to adopt an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact and to refrain from trade discrimination, provided all other nations reciprocated. However, Washington rejected these proposals as insufficient. Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono then offered to meet with Roosevelt personally, but Roosevelt insisted on reaching a fundamental agreement before any such high-level meeting could take place. The American ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, repeatedly urged Roosevelt to accept the meeting, warning that it was the only way to preserve the conciliatory Kono government and maintain peace in the Pacific. His recommendation, however, was not acted upon. The Kono government collapsed the following month when the Japanese military refused to accept a withdrawal of all troops from China. Japan's final proposal, delivered on November 20th, offered to withdraw from southern Indochina and to refrain from further attacks in Southeast Asia, but only on the condition that the United States, United Kingdom, and Netherlands supply Japan with 1 million US gallons of aviation fuel, lifted all sanctions, and ceased all aid to China. The American counterproposal, known as the Hull Note and delivered on November 26, required Japan to completely and unconditionally evacuate China and to conclude non-aggression pacts with all Pacific powers. In Japan, this was seen as an ultimatum. The day before the note's delivery, on November 26, the Japanese task force had already set sail for Pearl Harbor. From the Japanese point of view, the attack was a preemptive strike of necessity, launched before the oil gauge ran empty. The military planning for the attack was both meticulous and audacious. Preliminary planning for an attack on Pearl Harbor to protect the move into the southern resource area began early in 1941 under the auspices of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He won assent for formal planning and training from the reluctant Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff only after intense contention, even threatening to resign his command. Full-scale planning was underway by early spring, led primarily by Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kusaka, with key assistance from Commander Minoru Genda, the master tactician of the air operation, and Captain Kamito Kurashima, Yamamoto's deputy chief of staff. The planners studied the 1940 British aerial torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto with great intensity, learning vital lessons about the vulnerability of a fleet at anchor. Over the next several months, pilots underwent rigorous training, equipment was specially adapted for the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, and intelligence was diligently collected. Despite these extensive preparations, Emperor Hirohito did not approve the attack plan until November 5, after the third of 4 imperial conferences called to consider the matter. He initially hesitated but eventually authorized the strike, giving his final approval on December 1 after a majority of his advisors warned him that the terms of the Hull Note would destroy the fruits of the war in China and undermine Japanese control of its empire. The Japanese attack had several clearly defined objectives. First and foremost, it intended to destroy the most important units of the American Pacific Fleet, particularly its battleships, thereby preventing it from interfering with the Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. The leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy were strong subscribers to the naval doctrine of Alfred Thayer Mahan, which emphasized the concept of a decisive battle, in which the enemy's main battle fleet would be destroyed in a single, crushing engagement. Second, it was hoped the attack would buy Japan valuable time to consolidate its new position and increase its naval strength before the massive American shipbuilding program authorized by the 1942 Ocean Navy Act could tilt the balance of power irrevocably in America's favor. Third, by delivering a shocking blow to America's primary symbol of naval power, the battleship, Japan hoped to severely undermine American morale and its ability to mobilize forces in the Pacific. Finally, there was a hope that such a devastating surprise attack would demoralize the American public and government to such an extent that they would drop their demands in the Pacific and seek a negotiated peace compromise, leaving Japan as the dominant power in East Asia. The approach of the Japanese task force was executed with remarkable secrecy and precision. On November 26, 1941, the striking force, known as the WWII, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, departed Hitokapu Bay in the remote Kurile Islands, en route to a designated launch point northwest of Hawaii. Their mission was to launch 408 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor, 360 for the 2 attack waves and 48 reserved for defensive combat air patrol over the fleet. The attack plan was carefully structured. The first wave was to be the primary strike, focusing on the American battleships and aircraft carriers. The second wave's first objective was to target any American carriers, then cruisers, with battleships as a tertiary target. The first wave carried the specialized weapons for attacking capital ships, most importantly the Type 91 aerial torpedo, which had been modified with an anti-roll mechanism and a wooden rudder extension that allowed it to operate in the shallow 40-foot depth of Pearl Harbor. The air crews received strict orders to select the highest value targets, battleships and aircraft carriers, first. If those were not present, they were to attack any other high-value ships, such as cruisers and destroyers. The dive bombers in the first wave were assigned to attack ground targets and airfields, while the Zero fighters were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked aircraft as possible to ensure they did not get airborne to intercept the bombers. Before the main air attack commenced, the Japanese launched reconnaissance floatplanes from the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Tone to perform a final scouting of Oahu and the alternative anchorage at Lahaina Roads, Maui. Their orders were to report on the exact composition and location of the American fleet. In reality, These flights were risky as they could have alerted the Americans, and they were largely unnecessary. A detailed report on the fleet's composition and state of readiness was already known from the intelligence provided by Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa, operating from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The report from Tone's floatplane confirming the absence of the American fleet at Lahaina was received, as was a report from the fleet's submarine I-72. To protect the task force, 4 additional scout planes were positioned between the WWII and the island of Niihau to detect any American counterattack. A unique and often overlooked component of the attack was the force of 5 fleet submarines, each carrying a Type A midget submarine. These vessels, I-16, I-18, I-20, I-22, and I-24, left Kure Naval District on November 25. On December 6, they positioned themselves within 10 nautical miles of the entrance to Pearl Harbor and launched their midget subs in the early hours of December 7. Their mission was to penetrate the harbor and attack ships during the aerial bombardment. However, their role was marked by failure. At 3:42 Hawaiian time, the minesweeper USS Condor spotted a midget submarine's periscope near the harbor entrance buoy and alerted the destroyer USS Ward. The Ward sank one of the midget submarines at 6:37 in what were the first American shots fired in the Pacific Theater. Another midget submarine managed to enter the harbor and fired its torpedoes at the seaplane tender USS Curtis and the attacking destroyer USS Monaghan, missing both before being sunk by the Monaghan at 8:43. A third midget submarine, Ha-19, ran aground twice and was captured on December 8, and its commander, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese prisoner of war. The fate of the 5th midget submarine was a mystery for decades until its wreckage was discovered in 3 parts outside Pearl Harbor in the 1990s and early 2000s. There is some evidence, including a controversial analysis of a Japanese aerial photograph, that suggests this submarine may have successfully fired its torpedoes at Battleship Row, potentially contributing to the sinking of the USS West Virginia and the capsizing of the USS Oklahoma. A critical and enduring aspect of the attack was its timing in relation to a formal declaration of war. It was Admiral Yamamoto's specific intention that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were at an end. However, the delivery of what is known as the 14-part message to the Japanese embassy in Washington was delayed by transcription and decoding. The 5,000-word message, which detailed Japan's position and effectively severed negotiations, was not presented to the U.S. Secretary of State until more than an hour after the attack had begun. American codebreakers had already deciphered and translated most of the message hours earlier. The final parts of the message stated that the hope of the Japanese government to adjust relations was finally lost, and that it considered it impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. While strongly worded, this was not a declaration of war. The failure to deliver this message before the attack, whether by accident or, as some historians argue, by deliberate design within parts of the Japanese military, cemented the American perception of the attack as a treacherous and unprovoked act, perfectly encapsulated in President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech. The first wave of the attack, comprising 183 planes led by Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, was detected by the U.S. Army's relatively new SCR-270 radar station at Opana Point near the northern tip of Oahu. The operators, Privates George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockard, spotted a large formation on their screen and reported it to the Information Center at Fort Shafter. The newly assigned officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, aware that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected from the U.S. mainland, assumed the large blip was that friendly flight and famously told the radar operators, "Well, don't worry about it." This tragic misjudgment, combined with communication delays and a general state of low alert, meant that Pearl Harbor remained unprepared. The attack began at 7:48 a.m. with the first bombs falling on the Naval Air Station at Kaneohe Bay. The first wave was a coordinated assault of 3 groups. The first group targeted the battleships and aircraft carriers. It included 49 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers armed with heavy 800 kg armor-piercing bombs, and 40 more Kates armed with Type 91 torpedoes. The second group, consisting of 51 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers armed with 550 pounds general-purpose bombs, targeted Ford Island and Wheeler Field. The third group was composed of 43 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, whose role was to establish air control and strafe aircraft on the ground at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Barbers Point. The scene that unfolded was one of utter chaos and destruction. Men aboard the ships were jolted awake by the sounds of explosions, alarms, and machine gun fire, rushing to their battle stations in a state of shock and confusion. The famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill, was sent from the headquarters of Patrol Wing 2, the first senior command to respond. American defenses were caught completely off guard, ammunition lockers were locked, aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to prevent sabotage, and anti-aircraft guns were largely unmanned. Only a quarter of the Navy's machine guns and only 4 of the Army's 31 anti-aircraft batteries managed to get into action. Despite the overwhelming surprise, countless acts of heroism emerged from the chaos. Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr., aboard the USS Nevada, commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns and was severely wounded but refused to leave his post. Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas, on the Nevada in the captain's absence, managed to get the battleship underway in a daring attempt to escape the harbor, a move that made her a target for a second wave of Japanese bombers and forced her to be deliberately beached to avoid blocking the channel. The destroyer USS Islewind got underway with only 4 ensigns aboard, none with more than a year of sea duty, and operated at sea for 36 hours before her commanding officer could return. Captain Mervyn Benyon, commanding the USS West Virginia, led his men with exceptional courage until he was cut down by shrapnel from a bomb that hit the USS Tennessee, moored alongside. The second wave of the attack, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived over Pearl Harbor around 8:50 a.m. It consisted of 171 planes, 54 B-5N Kates, 81 D-3A Vals, and 36 A-6M Zeros. This wave was structured differently from the first. The first group of Kates was armed with general-purpose bombs and tasked with striking the airfields and hangars at Kaneohe, Ford Island, and Barbers Point to complete the destruction of American air power. The second group, the 78 Val dive bombers, had aircraft carriers and cruisers as their primary targets. The third group of 35 Zero fighters provided air cover and continued the strafing of ground targets. By this time, American anti-aircraft fire had intensified considerably, making the second wave more dangerous for the Japanese aircrews. The separate sections of this wave arrived at the attack point almost simultaneously from several directions, adding to the confusion and terror on the ground. When the last Japanese plane departed after 90 minutes of assault, the scale of the devastation was almost incomprehensible. The human cost was horrific. 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 were wounded. The Navy suffered the heaviest losses, with 2,008 sailors killed and 710 wounded. The Army lost 218 soldiers and airmen killed and 364 wounded. The Marines had 109 killed and 69 wounded. Tragically, 68 civilians were also killed and 35 wounded, many of them by improperly fused American anti-aircraft shells falling back to Earth. All of the Americans killed or wounded were legally non-combatants, as a formal state of war did not exist at the moment of the attack. Nearly half of the total American fatalities occurred in a single, catastrophic instant aboard the USS Arizona. A modified 16-inch armor-piercing bomb, dropped by a high-level bomber, penetrated the forward deck and detonated the ship's main ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was so massive that it ripped the ship apart and killed 1,177 officers and crewmen in a matter of seconds. The Arizona became a tomb for most of her crew and the single greatest symbol of the tragedy. The other battleships suffered grievously. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside. 429 were killed. The USS West Virginia, hit by 2 bombs and 7 torpedoes, sank to the harbor bottom. The USS California, hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes, slowly flooded and settled into the mud. The USS Nevada, despite her valiant attempt to escape, was hit by multiple bombs and a torpedo and had to be beached to avoid sinking in the channel. The USS Pennsylvania was in dry dock and sustained lesser damage, while the USS Tennessee and USS Maryland were damaged but remained afloat. The destruction extended far beyond Battleship Row. The light cruiser USS Helena was torpedoed, and the concussion from the blast capsized the mine layer USS Oglala beside her. 2 destroyers in dry dock, the USS Cassin and USS Downs, were wrecked by bombs that ignited their fuel bunkers. The destroyer USS Shaw was hit by 3 bombs, and her forward magazine detonated in a spectacular fireball. The seaplane tender USS Curtis and the repair ship USS Vestal were also heavily damaged. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged, the vast majority of them caught on the ground. Only a handful of American pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with shooting down at least 1 Japanese aircraft. First Lieutenant Lewis M. Sanders and Second Lieutenants Philip M. Rasmussen, Kenneth M. Taylor, George S. Welch, Harry W. Brown, and Gordon H. Sterling Jr. Japanese losses were minimal in comparison. 55 airmen and 9 submariners were killed. Of the 414 planes involved in the raid, 29 were lost, 9 in the first wave and 20 in the second, with another 74 damaged by anti-aircraft fire. In the aftermath of the attack, a vigorous debate ensued among the Japanese command about launching a third strike. Some junior officers, including Commander Fukuda, argued for a third wave to target the crucial shore facilities, the Navy Yard, the submarine base, and, most importantly, the massive oil tank farms. Destroying these would have crippled the U.S. Navy's ability to use Pearl Harbor as a forward base for years. However, Admiral Nagumo made the decision to withdraw. He was concerned about the increasing American anti-aircraft fire, the unknown location of the American aircraft carriers, the risk of having to recover his planes after nightfall, and the dwindling fuel of his task force. He believed the primary mission of neutralizing the U.S. battle fleet had been accomplished. In retrospect, this decision was a critical strategic error. The survival of Pearl Harbor's infrastructure allowed the United States to project power into the Pacific much sooner than the Japanese had anticipated. The news of the attack sent shockwaves across the United States. The next day, December 8, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, his voice firm and resolute over the radio. He labeled December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, and asked for a declaration of war against Japan, which was approved with near unanimous support. On December 11, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States, and Congress reciprocated the same day, formally plunging America into the global conflict of World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor had immediate and profound consequences. It instantly united a previously divided American public, galvanizing the nation for a total war effort. It also led to one of the most tragic domestic policies in American history: the forced relocation and internment of over 110,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of whom were U.S. citizens, based on unfounded fears of disloyalty. Strategically, while Japan had won a stunning tactical victory, it had, in the words of one of its own admirals, awakened a sleeping giant. The failure to destroy the American carriers and the base's infrastructure proved fatal to Japan's long-term war aims. The U.S. Navy, forced to rely on its aircraft carriers, would turn the tide at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 5 months later, and then deliver a decisive blow to the Japanese carrier force at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The submarines and the repaired battleships of Pearl Harbor would go on to relentlessly attack Japanese shipping and support the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The date that Japan had hoped would bring a short war and a negotiated peace instead marked the beginning of a long, grueling conflict that would end with the utter defeat of the Empire of Japan and the emergence of the United States as a dominant world power. The attack on Pearl Harbor was indeed a day of infamy, but it was also the day that forged a new and determined American resolve. The salvage operation that began in the aftermath of the attack was one of the most monumental feats of naval engineering in history. Under the leadership of Captain Homer N. Wallen, a massive effort was launched to refloat, repair, and return to service the shattered Pacific Fleet. Divers from the Navy, the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and civilian contractors like the Pacific Bridge Company worked tirelessly in hazardous conditions. They patched gaping holes in hulls, cleared twisted debris, and pumped millions of gallons of water from sunken ships. The work was perilous. Men like Navy diver Melvin Storer worked inside the dark, oil-slicked interiors of damaged ships, facing the constant risk of structural collapse and poisonous gases. In one tragic incident, 2 men died after inhaling toxic fumes trapped within the USS Nevada. This intensive salvage effort, which totaled some 20,000 man-hours underwater, yielded remarkable results. Within 6 months, 5 of the 8 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated and sent to shipyards at Pearl Harbor and on the U.S. mainland for extensive repair. The USS Maryland and USS Tennessee were the first battleships to return to service by early 1942. The USS Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock, was also quickly repaired. The USS California was raised and returned to service in January 1944 after a comprehensive rebuild. The USS West Virginia, one of the most heavily damaged, underwent a massive reconstruction and returned to service in July 1944, boasting a modernized appearance and advanced anti-aircraft armament. The USS Nevada was refloated, repaired, and returned to service in October 1942. Even the destroyers Cassin and Downs, which had been burned out in dry dock, were reconstructed using their salvageable machinery and new hulls, returning to the fleet in 1943 and 1944, respectively. Where full repair was not feasible, armament and valuable equipment were stripped from the most severely damaged vessels and used to improve the harbor's defenses or installed on other ships. Only the USS Arizona and the target ship USS Utah were deemed too catastrophically damaged for salvage. They remain on the bottom of Pearl Harbor as permanent war graves and memorials. The USS Oklahoma was raised in a monumental effort in 1943, but she was never repaired and, while under tow to the mainland to be scrapped in 1947, capsized and sank in a storm. The news of the attack broke across the United States like a thunderclap. The initial announcement was made by White House Press Secretary Stephen Early at 2:22 p.m. Eastern Time. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands, he told the approximately 150 reporters gathered. As more information poured in, Early continued to provide updates throughout the afternoon. The first radio reports hit the airwaves moments later, with John Charles Daly on the CBS network interrupting scheduled programming to deliver the stunning news. Newspapers rushed out extra editions with banner headlines, and the story dominated the airwaves, unifying the nation in a mix of shock, anger, and resolve. In Japan, the news was announced shortly after 7 a.m. Japanese Standard Time on December 8, framed as an imperial order and a necessary response to American encirclement. Press coverage in the heavily censored wartime state was uniformly triumphant. The Asahi Shimbun, a major newspaper, immediately began publishing editorials that fully backed the government's decision, framing the war as a righteous struggle for Asia's liberation. NHK, the National Broadcasting Corporation, interrupted its schedule with 12 special news reports that day, presenting the attacks on Pearl Harbor and other Allied bases as a great victory. The political and strategic aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech to Congress on December 8 was a masterful rallying cry that resulted in a near-unanimous declaration of war against Japan. As Churchill had promised, the United Kingdom declared war on Japan within hours, even before the U.S. did. The following days saw the war expand globally. On December 11, Adolf Hitler, disregarding the fact that Japan was the aggressor and that the Tripartite Pact did not obligate him to intervene, declared war on the United States, a decision that Roosevelt and Congress immediately reciprocated. This sequence of events perfectly resolved the great strategic dilemma that had preoccupied Washington: how to prioritize a two-front war. By forcing America's hand in the Pacific and then having Germany declare war, Japan and Hitler had, in effect, made the decision for them. The United States could now launch a massive war effort against both Japan and the European Axis powers under the Germany First policy agreed upon with the British. The attack also had severe consequences for Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. In the United States, long-standing prejudices, compounded by the shock of the attack and the Nihao incident, where a downed Japanese pilot received assistance from a Japanese-American couple, led to a wave of fear and paranoia. This culminated in President Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, which authorized the forced removal and internment of over 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of whom were American citizens, from the West Coast. They were relocated to bleak, remote camps for the duration of the war, a profound violation of their civil liberties. In Canada, a similar panic led to Order in Council PC No. 1486, which resulted in the internment of over 12,000 Japanese Canadians, the seizure of their property, and their forced relocation from the coast of British Columbia. In the long term, the strategic implications of Pearl Harbor became clear. While it was a brilliant tactical success for Japan, it proved to be a catastrophic strategic blunder. As Rear Admiral Chuchi Hara later lamented, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." The attack failed to destroy its most critical targets, the American aircraft carriers, which were fortuitously at sea, and the base's infrastructure, the repair yards, machine shops, and, most importantly, the massive oil tank farms. The survival of these facilities allowed Pearl Harbor to remain a functioning forward base, enabling the U.S. to project power across the Pacific far sooner than Japanese planners had believed possible. The U.S. Navy, forced to rely on its carrier force and submarines in the early stages of the war, quickly adapted. American submarines, in particular, would wage a devastating commerce war that strangled Japan's economy by crippling its merchant fleet and cutting off the flow of oil and raw materials from its newly conquered empire. The failure to deliver a formal declaration of war before the attack created a legacy of infamy that galvanized American public opinion for a long and bitter conflict. The rallying cry of "Remember Pearl Harbor" became the driving force behind the American war effort, ensuring that the nation would not rest until Japan's unconditional surrender. The attack, intended to demoralize the United States and secure a limited Japanese empire, instead awakened a dormant industrial giant, unified a divided people, and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the fall of the Japanese empire and the dawn of a new American era on the global stage. The sunken hull of the USS Arizona, resting in the clear waters of the harbor, remains a sacred memorial to the thousands who lost their lives on that fateful December morning, a permanent testament to the tragedy of war and the resilience of a nation.